Born into an ordinary yet struggling family, the boy's early years were filled with hardships. His parents, though hardworking, could barely make ends meet. Their small, cramped house in a rough neighborhood was a constant reminder of their poverty. There were days when food was scarce, and school fees were an impossible luxury. His father, a laborer, worked long hours but earned little, while his mother took odd jobs to support the household. Despite their efforts, life remained a daily battle. As a child, he was bright and full of potential, but the environment around him slowly began shaping his future. The streets were filled with crime, and gangsters roamed freely, acting as role models for many young boys who saw no future in honest labor. His neighborhood was notorious for its illegal activities. Drug dealing, theft, and violence were common. Seeing criminals flaunt their wealth while his parents struggled to survive planted a dangerous thought in his mind. Crime was an easier path to success. At school, he was often bullied for wearing torn clothes and having no lunch money. The humiliation made him resentful and angry. He started skipping classes, spending more time with older boys who had already chosen a life of crime. They introduced him to petty theft. At first, it was just stealing a few coins from a store counter when no one was looking. Then, it escalated to snatching wallets from distracted passers-by. He felt a rush every time he got away with it. More importantly, he enjoyed having money in his pocket, something he rarely experienced before. As his skills improved, so did his confidence. He became an expert pickpocket, moving through crowded streets unnoticed, targeting businessmen, tourists, and even school teachers. What started as a means of survival quickly turned into an addiction. The thrill of stealing without getting caught made him feel powerful. He was no longer the poor boy everyone pitied. He was in control. Soon, his crimes became more daring. He and his group of friends began breaking into small shops at night, stealing whatever they could sell. Each successful robbery boosted his ego, making him believe he was untouchable. He started spending his stolen money on expensive clothes, flashy accessories, and gifts for friends. People who once ignored him now admired him. He was no longer the struggling boy from a poor family. He was someone important, someone feared. However, with success came danger. The police began to notice him, and rival gangs saw him as competition. The older criminals who once guided him now viewed him as a threat. But instead of being afraid, he welcomed the challenge. He was ready to do whatever it took to stay on top. Unknowingly, he had stepped onto a path that would eventually lead him to a much darker fate. What began as small thefts to survive would soon spiral into something far more sinister, something that would change his life forever. As his reputation grew in the streets, the boy found himself drawn deeper into the criminal underworld. What had started as petty theft and pickpocketing soon became something much more dangerous. He was no longer just another street thief, he was becoming someone who mattered in the eyes of local gangs. The older criminals who once dismissed him now took notice of his talent. His ability to move through crowds unnoticed, to steal without getting caught, and his fearless attitude made him valuable. One day, a well-known gang leader approached him with an offer: work for them, and in return, he'd get protection, better opportunities, and more money than he had ever imagined. Tempted by the promise of power and wealth, he agreed without hesitation, from theft to organized crime. His new role was simple at first. He ran errands for the gang, delivering messages, keeping an eye on police movements, and collecting money from local businesses who paid for protection. But soon, he was given bigger responsibilities. He started participating in robberies, breaking into warehouses, and helping smuggle stolen goods. With each crime, he felt his fear fade. The rush of outsmarting the police, the thrill of making fast money, and the respect he received from other criminals made him feel invincible. His gang treated him like a brother, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. But as he climbed higher in the ranks, the nature of his crimes changed. It was no longer just about stealing. Now, it was about power and control. The gang started using him for more serious tasks. He was taught how to handle weapons, how to intimidate people, and how to make sure no one dared to cross them. The first act of violence. One night, he was assigned a job that would change his life forever. A local shopkeeper had refused to pay protection money, believing he could defy the gang. His leader gave a simple order: make sure he understands who's in charge. At first, the boy thought he would just threaten the man, maybe break something in the shop, scare him a little, but when the shopkeeper fought back, panic took over. In the struggle, he struck the man with a metal rod. The impact was harder than he intended. The man collapsed, blood pooling beneath him. For a moment, everything was silent. His hands trembled as he stared at what he had done. He hadn't meant to hurt him, at least not this badly. But there was no turning back now. His gang cheered him on, patting him on the back, telling him he had become a man. Something inside him changed that night. The fear he once felt was replaced with something else, something darker. The guilt faded quickly, buried under the need to prove himself. The boy who once only stole to survive had now crossed a line. And from that moment on, violence became just another part of his world. The first time he took a life, it wasn't planned. It wasn't something he had ever imagined himself doing. But in the world he now lived in, violence was survival, and hesitation meant death. It happened late one night in a dimly lit alley, the kind of place where trouble found people who weren't looking for it. But this time, trouble had come looking for him. A rival gang had been watching him for weeks, jealous of how quickly he was rising in the ranks. They saw him as a threat, an outsider who had gained too much power too fast. One of them, a tall, muscular man with a scar across his cheek, finally confronted him. The confrontation started with threats, warnings to back off, to leave the territory, or face the consequences. But he wasn't one to back down. Words turned into shoves, and shoves turned into fists. Before he knew it, the man pulled a knife. Instinct took over. In a blind moment of panic and desperation, he grabbed the gun tucked in his waistband and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the alley, louder than anything he had ever heard before. The man stumbled back, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock. A second later, he collapsed. Blood spread beneath him, dark and unforgiving. For a moment, the world stood still. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had just killed someone. No turning back. Fear gripped him. He knew what happened to people who got caught for murder. His gang members rushed to his side, dragging him away before the police could arrive. "You did what had to be done," one of them said. "Welcome to the real world." That night, something inside him changed. The guilt and fear he had felt at first faded quickly. The way his gang treated him afterward, like a warrior, like a leader, made it easier to accept. Killing had been a necessity, a choice between his life and the other man's. And in his world, there was no room for weakness, but the murder had consequences. The police now had his name. His face was on their radar. Witnesses from the rival gang wanted revenge. He could no longer walk the streets as freely as before. Every day was a game of survival, every shadow a possible threat. Diving deeper into crime. To stay ahead, he immersed himself even deeper in crime. He became more ruthless, more strategic. He learned how to cover his tracks, how to manipulate people, how to make sure no one could betray him. The more feared he became, the more powerful he felt. What had started as a desperate act of self-defense became the first step into a life where violence was the answer to every problem. The boy who had once stolen to survive had now become something else. A killer. A name whispered in fear. And there was no turning back. The first kill had been out of desperation. The second was easier. By the third, he no longer hesitated. With every crime, every life taken, the fear and doubt that once haunted him faded away. He was no longer just a petty thief or a gang enforcer. He was becoming a man feared by both criminals and law enforcement alike. In his world, mercy was a weakness, and he had no room for weakness anymore. Fearless and merciless. His gang saw his potential, and soon he was given more responsibility. He wasn't just carrying out orders, he was making decisions. He decided who lived, who paid, and who disappeared. Anyone who crossed him or showed even the slightest sign of betrayal was dealt with swiftly. At first, he only killed when necessary, rival gang members, those who threatened his power. But over time, it became something more, a show of dominance, a way to send a message. Killing was no longer just survival, it was control. The more ruthless he became, the more his influence grew. He built a network of loyal followers, people who feared and respected him. He no longer needed to do the dirty work himself. He had men who would kill on his command. But sometimes, he still liked to do it personally. It reminded him of the power he held, eliminating threats. His enemies weren't just rival gangsters anymore. He knew that in this world, the biggest threat often came from within. A weak link, a disloyal friend, someone who talked too much. He made sure they didn't get the chance to betray him. One of his closest allies, a man he had once trusted, was rumored to be working with the police. At first, he didn't want to believe it, but in his world, trust was a dangerous gamble. He arranged a meeting, confronted the man, and looked him in the eye as he pulled the trigger. There was no anger, no hesitation, just cold efficiency. The message was clear. Betrayal meant death, becoming a notorious criminal. It wasn't long before his name was all over the news. The media painted him as a monster, a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. The police launched full-scale investigations, dedicating entire teams to tracking him down. But he was always one step ahead. He had informants in the police force, powerful connections that protected him. The streets spoke his name in whispers, a legend built on fear. Yet deep inside, something had changed. The boy who once stole just to survive was gone. In his place stood a man who no longer felt anything, no guilt, no fear, no regret. The path he had chosen had consumed him completely. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He was a killer. He had ruled the streets, feared by enemies and untouchable by the law. But no empire lasts forever. The walls were closing in, and he knew it. The police had been hunting him for months, gathering evidence, turning his closest allies against him. Some were arrested and flipped, giving up secrets in exchange for their own freedom. Others tried to run, but ended up dead, either by the police or at the hands of his enemies. The rival gangs, once afraid to challenge him, saw an opportunity. He was no longer untouchable. They wanted revenge for the people he had killed, the power he had taken from them. He was running out of options. The fall one night, he received a tip. His enemies were planning an ambush. But he had faced worse before. Armed and ready, he walked into the trap, thinking he could fight his way out. The gunfire was deafening. Bullets tore through the air as he fought to escape, but this time, luck wasn't on his side. A shot hit his shoulder, then another in his leg. He stumbled, bleeding, his body refusing to move the way it once did. The police arrived minutes later, surrounding the scene. There was no escape. His enemies had led him straight into their hands. He had been invincible for so long that he had forgotten. No one outruns fate forever. With blood dripping from his wounds, he dropped his gun. For the first time in years, he felt something he had buried long ago. Exhaustion facing justice. His trial was a media sensation. The country watched as the man who had terrorized the streets for years now stood in chains. The prosecutors listed his crimes: murder, extortion, drug trafficking. Witnesses came forward, people who had once feared him now eager to see him fall. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Life in prison, no chance of parole. The death penalty had been considered, but the court decided a lifetime behind bars was a more fitting punishment. For the first time in years, he was powerless. No gang, no weapons, no money to buy his way out. Just cold prison walls and the weight of everything he had done. Regret or redemption. Sitting alone in his cell, he thought about the boy he used to be, the boy who once stole to survive, who never imagined becoming a killer. Where had it all gone wrong? Was there ever a chance to change? Some said he felt no regret, that he was a monster until the end. Others believed he spent his final years in silence, haunted by the ghosts of those he had killed. But the truth, no one really knows.